You've probably come across a photo of a huge cargo ship sitting completely still in the middle of the open ocean, far from any coastline, and just kept scrolling. No second thought. But it's actually worth questioning. In major shipping lanes, the ocean can be around 12,000 feet deep. That's an enormous amount of water beneath the ship's hull. So where does the anchor actually go? Is it just hanging in the darkness? What if the chain isn't long enough? Why doesn't the ship start drifting as soon as the current shifts? And in rough weather, can a solid piece of steel really hold something the size of an apartment building against a force 10 gale? Here's the part that might completely change how you see those ship photos from now on. First, we need to understand what anchoring really means, because it's not what most people imagine. The common picture, inspired by cartoons and tattoos, is a hook-shaped anchor digging into the seabed and holding a ship in place like a tent peg. But that idea is almost entirely wrong. Anchoring isn't about fixing the ship to one point on the ocean floor. It's about creating controlled resistance. And surprisingly, the main force doing that job isn't even the anchor itself, it's the chain. Here's where the misunderstanding comes from, and why it stuck around. Most people imagine an anchor digging in, locking firmly, and the ship staying fixed right above it. But in reality, an anchor isn't built to handle an upward pull. It's designed to lie flat and resist force coming from the side. Those wing-like blades on the anchor, called flukes, only dig into the seabed when the pull is almost parallel to the ocean floor. The moment that force tilts upward too steeply, they release, and that's intentional. Anchors are actually designed to let go at the wrong angle so they can be retrieved when needed. But here's the surprising part. On its own, the anchor wouldn't do much at all. The real work starts with the chain, and what it does is clever. Instead of hanging straight down, the chain drops from the ship's bow, sinks through the water, and settles into a smooth, sagging curve along the seabed. This curve is called a catenary. Think of a heavy necklace draped between two fingers. That natural sag, that gentle arc, is the same shape, and mathematically, that curve does something important. It reduces the tension where the chain meets the seafloor to almost zero in the vertical direction. In simple terms, the anchor feels a sideways pull, not an upward one. That's exactly what you want. The flukes dig in sideways, grip the seabed, and stay locked. Meanwhile, the chain handles the movement. You can think of it like a massive iron leash, but one that weighs as much as a pickup truck. When the ship starts to drift, the chain doesn't immediately snap tight and yank the anchor loose. Instead, it sinks a little more, absorbing the energy, similar to how suspension bridge cables smooth out vibrations from traffic. Only after that does it pass along a steady, horizontal pull to the anchor. And the scale of this system is wild. A single link in a large ship's anchor chain can weigh between 175 and 300 pounds, about the weight of a fully grown adult. Now imagine hundreds of those links connected together. On a supertanker, the full chain can exceed 100 tons, heavier than multiple elephants combined. And its main job? To hang in the right curve. This brings us to something called the scope ratio, the relationship between the length of chain used and the depth of the water. In calm conditions, sailors typically aim for about 5 to 1. 5 feet of chain for every foot of depth. In rough weather, that increases to around 10 to 1. So if a ship is anchored in 100 feet of water during a storm, it might need around 1,000 feet of chain lying in a heavy, curved shape across the seafloor, just to keep everything stable. That's why anchored ships move in wide, slow circles when the wind changes. They're not fixed in place. They're connected to a long, incredibly heavy leash, and the entire system pivots around a single point on the seabed. But what happens out in the open ocean, where the water is miles deep? This is where most people get it wrong. Ships don't anchor in extremely deep water. They simply can't. No chain is long enough, and even if it were, lifting that kind of weight back up would be nearly impossible. Here's the shift in thinking that changes everything. Anchoring and mooring are not the same thing. Anchoring means the ship carries its own anchor and chain, drops it temporarily, and later pulls it back up. This works in relatively shallow waters, typically a few hundred feet deep, sometimes stretching toward 1,000 in emergencies. Mooring, on the other hand, is a completely different setup. It relies on permanent structures already installed on the seabed, massive concrete blocks, driven piles, or specially engineered anchors. These are connected by heavy chains to floating buoys on the surface. The ship doesn't bring its own gear. It simply arrives and ties up to the buoy. Everything is pre-built and designed specifically for that location. So those dramatic images of ships sitting still in the middle of the ocean, in most cases, they're moored, not anchored. Different system, different physics, entirely different scale. And then there's a third method that sounds almost futuristic, but it's very real: dynamic positioning. Advanced offshore vessels, like drill ships, floating production platforms, and pipe-laying barges, often don't use anchors at all. Instead, they're equipped with multiple thrusters placed around the hull, capable of pushing in every direction. A highly precise GPS system tracks the ship's position down to centimeters, feeding data to a computer hundreds of times per second. That system constantly adjusts the thrusters in tiny bursts, countering wind, waves, and currents all at once, keeping the vessel locked in place without ever touching the seabed. The most advanced ships today can stay perfectly still using nothing but software and controlled thrust. It's like keeping a car parked in one spot by continuously making tiny adjustments against the wind. Anchoring itself is an ancient idea, but understanding how it truly works took far longer than you'd expect. The earliest anchors were nothing more than stones tied to rope, crude, heavy, and often unreliable. Greek sailors even used baskets filled with rocks, assuming that more weight meant better holding power. They weren't completely wrong, but they were missing the most important factor. Historians generally agree that sometime around 400 to 500 BCE, the Greeks, and later the Romans, introduced a crucial upgrade, a crossbar known as a stock. It sounds simple, but it changed everything. The stock forced the anchor to land the right way every time, with the flukes facing downward toward the seabed. Before that, an anchor could easily fall on its side and do absolutely nothing while the ship drifted. With the stock in place, it would reliably dig in and hold. The Romans took things further, experimenting with composite designs using wood and lead, arguably the first anchors that were truly engineered rather than just shaped stones. As for the classic Admiralty-style anchor, the one you've seen on naval emblems and sailor tattoos, it didn't become widespread until the 1800s. By then, it was the result of centuries of gradual refinement. Every improvement came from real-world experience, storms, failures, and shipwrecks. Nothing was theoretical. No one sat down and calculated the perfect curve of a catenary. Instead, sailors learned through trial and error, losing ships until only the designs that worked survived and became standard practice. And that's the part that should really make you stop and think. The curve that keeps a 300,000-ton ship from drifting into a busy shipping lane, the catenary, isn't some rare, specialized concept. It's everywhere around you. Look up at the power lines outside your window. That gentle sag between poles? Same shape. Suspension bridges like the Golden Gate or the Brooklyn Bridge rely on it too. Their cables aren't pulled tight. They hang in a curve on purpose, because that sag is where the real strength comes from. A hammock forms a catenary. Every time you lie in one, you're literally resting inside the same physics that holds massive ships in place. Even a playground swing, when it's still, hangs in that exact curve. Swim out to a buoy at the beach, and you'll find the same principle scaled down. It's held by a small anchor, relying on that low-angle pull to stay locked into the seabed, just like a supertanker, only simpler. Offshore oil platforms take this even further. They're secured by 6 to 12 mooring lines stretching outward in a wide pattern. Each line forms its own catenary, and together they hold a structure the size of a city block steady against open ocean forces. Cruise ships waiting outside crowded ports, something that happens all the time in places like Nassau, Cozumel, or Santorini, often sit anchored in 100 to 200 feet of water. Passengers eat breakfast, completely unaware that the ship isn't tied to a dock at all. On aircraft carriers, the scale becomes extreme. Their anchor chains are so massive that each link is individually forged and inspected before being assembled. Even the fiber optic cables running along the ocean floor, the ones carrying most of the world's internet, are carefully weighted and laid in catenary curves to prevent stress and damage. River barges use the same idea in reverse, anchoring upstream and letting the current gently press them back against the tension in the chain. And looking ahead, there's even research into space tethers, long cables connecting satellites to other masses, using catenary-like geometry in orbit to maintain position without constant fuel use. It's the same simple shape, repeated everywhere, from playgrounds to oceans, and maybe one day, even in space. The same curve shows up everywhere, but anchoring can still fail. That's the part no postcard ever shows you. Anchor drag, when the anchor breaks loose and the ship begins to drift quietly, can happen in storms, in poor seabed conditions, when there isn't enough chain deployed, or when the seafloor simply isn't suitable. Sand holds well, hard mud is unpredictable, weed is risky, and rock almost useless. The flukes can't grip what they can't penetrate. That means a $200 million container ship can slowly start drifting toward danger at 3 a.m., just because the anchor landed on a patch of kelp instead of sand. That's why anchored ships are never truly left alone. Anchor watch is a constant, active responsibility. Crew members continuously monitor the ship's position using GPS, comparing it to a fixed reference point. The engines stay on standby, ready to respond the moment anything shifts, because anchor drag does happen. But modern systems can detect even small movements within just a few meters. When that happens, alarms go off, the crew wakes up, engines fire, and the ship powers back into position, usually before anything goes wrong. So here's where everything comes together. You might have started with the idea that anchoring works like driving a stake into the ground, something sharp forced into something solid. But in reality, it's a physics problem solved through geometry. The anchor itself is almost a secondary player. The real system is the curve, the massive, sagging chain that reshapes how force moves through it. Its weight transforms the ship's drifting motion into a slow, controlled, sideways pull, something the flukes can actually resist against the seabed. What began as sailors tying rocks to ropes evolved over 2,000 years of trial, error, and survival. And now, in some cases, it's replaced entirely by GPS-driven systems running on hardware smaller than a microwave. So the next time you see a ship sitting still in open water, you're not looking at something parked, you're looking at geometry in action. And if that feels counterintuitive, just wait until you see how ships steer when they're moving backward. That's a completely different kind of physics, and just as surprising.